John Martin is a Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow and a retired Columbia University professor. During his illustrious journalism career, he served as an ABC News national correspondent based in Washington and New York from 1975 to 2002. Among the many stories you covered, one big one that is in the annals of American history, the Iran-Contra Affair. And you mentioned that perhaps there are people who tuned in late, so maybe you should tell them what that was.
Well, that was an affair, a scandal. It actually, in some ways, rivaled Watergate in terms of what the executive branch did and what Congress did. But what it was a tension between the executive branch, President Reagan, and Congress over what to do about Central America. President Reagan gave more speeches about Central America than any other topic when he was president. We don't remember that now. But one morning in 1984, there was a kind of a premonition about what was going on. All of what had gone ahead before was a secret network. And what the network would do finally be exposed in 1986, it took missiles, sold them to Iran against an embargo that the United States had applied to Iran and other terrorist countries, and then took the money. I should explain. They sold the missiles to Iran in hopes that Iran would help get hostages released from Lebanon. I mean, it's an immense, complex plot. And then they took the money and gave some of it to the Contras in Nicaragua, who were trying to overthrow a pro-communist government in Managua. And we knew nothing about this until one Sunday morning, and I had just gone to work with David Brinkley, and suddenly there was a story to be covered.
So we have the report that you filed on ABC Nightly News where you talked to Dan Moynihan, among others. So,
actually, it was the David Brinkley show. The
Brinkley Sunday show. Yes,
Sunday
not
show.
ABC Nightly News, right.
Yeah.
So we'll take a look at that, and then
right.
we can come back and talk about it. Let's take a look.
First, the news since the Sunday morning papers. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, angry at what he calls a breach of trust by the CIA, announces he will resign as vice chairman of the Senate Committee on Intelligence. Had the committee been told about the mining of Nicaragua's harbor, he says, it would have refused to approve it. But he says the committee was not adequately briefed and was the victim of a breach of trust. Here's Senator Moynihan with ABC's John Martin in today's background report on the boiling dispute about U.S. policy in Central America. John?
5 weeks ago, David, in a room sealed off on the 4th floor of the Capitol, the Director of Central Intelligence mentioned a plan to mine the harbors of Nicaragua. It was one sentence, 27 words in 2 hours of words to a select group of senators. But this week, like an explosive, that sentence blew up under Ronald Reagan's Central American policy. The House refused to fund it. Both houses called on the president to stop the mining as a violation of international law, in the words of Senator Barry Goldwater. And this morning, Senator Patrick Moynihan says he is resigning as vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee as a protest of what he calls a violation of trust.
Senator Goldwater made his judgment as clear as words could do, and 4 or 5 days after that, they still reject his judgment, so they now have my judgment in the only way I can make it, which is to say, I resign.
They are CIA Director William Casey, who insisted in this bulletin to employees this week that he had notified Congress on the mining as required by law, and UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, who called the mining legal and justified.
The evidence that Nicaragua is involved in promoting armed insurgency in El Salvador is truly beyond dispute. To portray Nicaragua as a victim in the current situation is a complete Orwellian inversion of what is actually happening.
Jeane Kirkpatrick talking about invoking Orwell.
I think, as I mentioned before, I think George Orwell was the patron saint of Iran-Contra because so much of what got said publicly was a twist of the truth, a denial of what was a reality going on. And what the Reagan administration did, and mostly its diplomatic, military, and intelligence people, they created a network to try to do too many things at once. And one of the things they were trying to do was to get the Sandinista government in Nicaragua to stop supporting rebels who were trying to overthrow the government of El Salvador. So you had this nest, rather fouled up nest of different policy aims. And during this time, Congress said, we don't want part of this. They passed the Boland Amendment, the famous Boland Amendment, which said, under no circumstances will you give money, raise money for the purpose of supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. So what the Reagan administration did was to set out to do it anyway, in secret.
Sounds like the plot of a movie, almost a brazen shadow government operating at the same time as the government we see.
Well, that's in fact an analysis by a former Woodrow Wilson Fellow at Michael Glennon at Tufts at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. He's written a book called National Security and Double Government. And this is a phrase that goes back into English politics. But it's the idea that a certain core of people who have very great experience kind of take over the policy and make sure that the aims that they think are important get covered. And the leadership sometimes is aware of it and sometimes is not. And then there was a lot of talk about, well, was Reagan really competent at the time? And it's clear that it's not clear what happened.
And the vice president, no operational role, famously claimed.
That's what he said.
Yeah. So 84, you file this story. At what point do the dots start to connect for you in a way that you realize you're onto a story of this scope and depth?
Well, it really wasn't until 86 when the Nicaraguan soldiers shot down a plane carrying weapons for the Contras. The lone survivor of that crash was a guy named Gene Hasenfus, and he is a former CIA loadmaster from Vietnam. He'd been trained, he'd worked in and out of that kind of government for a long time. The White House, the State Department, the CIA, the Defense Department all said, we don't know anything about him, there's nothing, you know. So I went to Nicaragua and I interviewed him in prison, and he flat out said, look, I'm caught between, you know, a rock and a hard place. He was trying to uphold his duty, but he said, look,
we have the clip.
You do have a clip, all right.
So why don't we take a look? We'll hear it straight from Hasenfus's mouth.
All right.
Hasenfus, and then we can come back and talk about it. Let's take a look.
I feel I'm a prisoner of politics right now. Our government doing so many things, and this government fighting back, and I'm a boat in between, stuck in the waves.
Hasenfus has admitted the plane he parachuted from carried military supplies to rebels trying to overthrow the government here. He said pilot William Cooper, who died in the crash, talked of high-level sponsors.
When an individual comes across and says, this is coming right out of the main room.
That was said?
That was said.
What did that mean to you?
Well, it's coming right out of the White House.
So when Eugene Hasenfus says right to the top, right to the White House, are you ready to fall out of your chair?
Just about. I don't know how I'm going to follow this up. I come back to Washington. He was going to stand trial in about a month or so. Come back to Washington. I get a phone call. A guy says, I flew for the CIA in Vietnam, and I'm now strafing Nicaraguan villages for the Contras, and innocent people are dying. And I feel guilty about it. So I met with him, and I thought, well, this guy is really, he's got something here. Well, he had a drinking problem, and he drank 14 Manhattans at lunch.
And you observed this?
I observed it, and I said, you know, I think this is the hallucinations of an alcoholic. I'm sorry, but he did know what was going on. And in fact, one hint he dropped, he said, the logistics are being handled out of Saudi Arabia. Well, in the ensuing investigation, which played out over 6 and 7 years, that came out. Money came from Saudi Arabia. Part of the money was used to buy missiles that were sold to Iran. There were parts of this scheme that were visible to reporters here in Washington, but we couldn't connect the dots. It was so complex that we missed a lot of the dots. I used to say it was the biggest scoop I never got.
So at what point in this process of investigative reporting, at what point does it reach that tipping point where it becomes a big story for the general public?
Well, I think when Hasenfus was shot down, because
so that's the moment.
Within a month and a half, there was a report in a Lebanese newspaper about the sale of missiles to Iran. So you had the whole horizon was opening up, and we began to look deeper and deeper, as did the government. And then they uncovered. There was a special prosecutor appointed in December of 86, and that became an ongoing story for the next 4 or 5 years. There was always some new aspect of it.
So we already referenced the notion that perhaps Ronald Reagan was not mentally at his highest point, and the denials from then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush. What is your thought on this with 3 decades of hindsight in the rearview mirror? Was it credible that the people at the top didn't know about this undertaking?
I think it's credible in one respect. The details of some of it were probably not known. I think it's not credible that they didn't, at least were aware of this network. Mm-hmm. And you look at President George Herbert Walker Bush, he pardoned his own national security advisor, one of I think it was 14 people who were indicted just on his last days in office. He pardoned Caspar Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense. So you had people throughout that organization, that administration, who really were found to be very closely allied with this. And of course, it violated Congress's intent, and it created an immense mistrust of the government.
We haven't mentioned the name Oliver North yet, who a lot of people associate as sort of the lead player in this drama. Talk to us about Oliver North.
Well, I think he was a lead player, but I think he was on the National Security Council, and he organized a lot of this. He found people in South America, in Central America. He found people throughout the world. But the real mastermind, and he was never called to task for it, was William Casey, head of the CIA. And the Walsh report, the special prosecutor's report, pointed out that he was almost certainly involved in setting up this network and in arranging, suggesting that it was a good idea to sell missiles to Iran and so on. He was never called to task. He died months, or actually I guess it was weeks before he was supposed to be questioned under oath. And so it was never clear what his role was.
2 final thoughts, John, both sort of historical perspective. One about the big story. Where does this fit in the annals of American history? Does it have its proper place? I've read things you've written where you compare it to Watergate. You said that earlier. But it certainly doesn't have the same status as Watergate as a mythical, iconic moment in American history. Does it have its proper place? Where does it live?
I think it has a proper place. It's in a line of scandals. The only reason that it's not as memorable, shall we say, as Watergate is, well, 2 reasons. One, the president never resigned. There was, as he did in Watergate.
Can't top that.
But number 2, I just think that the fact that nobody was really called to really punished for their role in this. There were so many pardons, and Congress actually has to accept some blame. Congress was so intent on finding out how it had been tricked that it gave immunity for testimony to Ollie North, who from the National Security Council, and for John Poindexter, and for others, and therefore they could not be prosecuted. So the villains were never called to task. And
Did this set a precedent for lack of accountability?
Well, it certainly came close to that. I was struck by what Charles Lewis, who's an investigative reporter and who co-founded the Center for Public Integrity, he wrote in his book recently, he said, in retrospect, something in Washington had seriously changed, undoubtedly for the worse. The will and the ability to hold those in power accountable had perceptibly weakened. And I think if you look at the last 30 years, that has been the case.
Final thing I want to ask you about is along the same lines, but on the more micro level. For you, in your profession, where does this rank?
There were a lot of big stories. So this was really one of maybe 4 or 5 big stories. I covered the alleged Kuwaiti incubator atrocity hoax, which was one story. I searched for Joseph Mengele. I did some other things that are kind of on par with it. This was the most far-reaching story that I've encountered in 35 years as a journalist.
And, well, it's great to look back at your excellent reporting then and now, John. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Appreciate it.